What is life? When and how does it begin? How do we know it's present? Can we end it at all? And if so, under what circumstances? Around the world, people are debating, discussing, arguing, and advocating when human life begins, and asking when it begins to have a moral value. At the very center of the abortion wars is a fundamental difference of opinion between people about the importance that people assign to life in the womb. Some dismiss it as just a bunch of cells that can be discarded at any time. Others argue that it constitutes the essential DNA present in a born person and should be respected as a unique, unborn, and developing individual. These are critical questions for our age. These lectures you are about to hear brings together an expert panel from the fields of science, psychology, medicine, and theology. We want to present and engage you with questions about the value of life in the womb. What is it? How did it get there? Does it matter? Do we have any obligation to it? And who gets to decide? Our first protagonist is going to look at things from a psychological point of view, as well as from a scientific point of view. Stuart Derbyshire is Associate Professor in Psychology at the National University of Singapore.
Okay, good morning everybody. When does life begin? What I mean by life is not cellular division, not a beating heart, not the capacity for repair. Not that those things don't matter, they do matter. They matter hugely. I vividly remember my partner 8 weeks pregnant with our first daughter, and our paediatrician asked with a sly grin, would you like us to find the heartbeat? Would you like me to find it for you? Damn right we would like that, we said. And so he found it. And I still remember the excitement of that whoosh, whoosh, boom, boom sound that filled the room. That sound meant something. It mattered. But it didn't matter to Hannah, our then unborn, unnamed, and as it happens, unsexed daughter. She was far from the life that any of us would recognize. She was not yet active, feeling, sensing, thinking, purposive, valuing, social, relating, caring, choosing, all those kinds of things. I've spent a lot of my career trying to work out when the various things in that list switch on. Movement, as an example, is fairly easy. Movement you can observe directly and objectively using an ultrasound from about 6 to 8 weeks. But movement isn't what we mean by active. When you're active, you're trying to do something. You're trying to get somewhere. You have a purpose. It's quite a reach, no pun intended, to suggest that the fetus is trying to do something or get somewhere. What would it be trying to do? Where would it be trying to go? If the fetus is trying to do something, then it must have thoughts directing its effort. The fetus is cause-pushed. It's not reason-pulled. Fetal actions are reflex actions, getting the organism ready for the tasks to come, like suckling, orienting, and flailing. Those fetal motor programs go off without option. The activity they beget happens without chosen variations. So maybe the fetus can't consciously choose an action. Perhaps, though, they have the neural sophistication to consciously sense the world around them, to be aware of the stimuli in their environment. Clever experiments have demonstrated that visual and auditory stimuli can cause a brain reaction in the fetus from around 16 weeks gestation. So it's argued that the fetus can see and hear, at least from a little before halfway through pregnancy. Except it depends what you mean by see and hear. If you look over to where I was sitting a moment ago, you'll identify there's a Rubik's Cube sat on the couch there. And the fact that the cube is separate from the glass and separate from the notes that are sitting on the chair and separate from the chair, surely those kinds of features would come to you automatically. Well, that's what neuroscientists thought until about 30 years ago, when it became possible for cataracts to be surgically removed and replaced with plastic lenses to restore sight. People who were unfortunate enough to be born with cataracts, or lived their entire lives blinded by them, now had the opportunity to have an operation and have their sight restored. It was broadly believed that once the operation restored sight, the patients would be able to move about the world and act upon it in the same way that you and I do. That they too would be able to identify the cubiness, the glassiness, the notes, the seat, and so forth. But that turned out to be wrong. When patients with their sight restored were shown a cube like that one there, they were massively confused. They identified up to 9 different objects being presented to them. The truth is that objects are ambiguous. Deciding what features do and don't belong together is not automatically delivered by eyes and brains, but it takes some time to understand and develop. You can get a taste of what the patients went through by looking at the Necker cube on the board over there. The Necker cube is a line drawing of a 3-dimensional cube. And at first sight, obviously, it's just a cube. But which corner pops out? Sometimes when you look here at the white corner, that will pop out at you. And sometimes when you look here at the yellow corner, that will pop out at you. So which is it? Is it the right way with this corner popping out, or the right way with that corner popping out? Or is it even a 3-dimensional cube at all? Isn't it just a series of lines on a blackboard? What the fetus experiences is not that. It might be something on the road towards that, and that's not so far from where I began. The fetus is alive, but not living a life as we know it. Finding a moral obligation based on a beating heart or a feature detector is not easy. The fetus most definitely does not have the neural structures necessary for binocular depth perception, for example. Those cells are going to develop in response to visual experience coordinated between the 2 eyes after the fetus is born. But you would surely think me more than a little odd if I suggested that the fetus could be terminated because it lacks the capacity for binocular depth perception. And similarly, you might find it quite peculiar to argue that we should not terminate the fetus because it can detect its salty environment. Why would we want to make a moral virtue out of tasting salt? Defending the fetus in and of itself because of what it inherently is, technically alive but not yet living a life, is difficult. The fetus is meaningful to us and for us, but not to itself and for itself. The potential parents, the fetus is highly meaningful, and we can defend the fetus because of what it is for the putative parents. Their desire for a child, their hopes and dreams embedded in the pregnancy, provide us with a potent moral basis to protect the fetus and nurture the pregnancy to term and birth. The fetus is also important and meaningful because of what it is for all of us. Our desire for a new generation to carry forward our human projects, to bring to fruition the promise of a better world after we have all gone. That also provides a potent moral basis to protect the fetus, nurture the pregnancy to term and birth. But those moral demands rest not on what the fetus is, but on what it abstractly promises. And if the woman carrying the fetus does not want to be pregnant, her concrete desire to control the life she is living will surpass the reality of the fetus that is technically alive, but not yet living a life. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Next, we're going to look at the question of fetal life from a scientific point of view. We're going to hear from Sandy Starr of the Progress Educational Trust.
The musician Mark Hollis, who died recently, said the following in one of the popular songs by his band Talk Talk. "Life's what you make it, don't backdate it, celebrate it, anticipate it." Where the English language has the word life, other languages have several words. For example, there are at least 3 different Koine Greek words for life, with subtly different meanings, used in the original manuscripts of the New Testament of the Christian Bible. But when you sift through all of the possible meanings of the concept life as it applies to us, I think they boil down to two basic meanings. First, there is a meaning of life that applies inclusively to humans and animals alike, as well as plants and microorganisms. And this meaning also applies at varying scales and degrees of complexity, not just to individual organisms, but downwards to organs, tissues, and cells, and upwards to populations and to entire species. And I shall refer to this meaning with the shorthand biological life. Second, there is a meaning of life that applies exclusively to human individuals, otherwise known as persons. I shall refer to this with the shorthand human life. And when I say human life, I do not take the word human to be directly equivalent to the scientific species name Homo sapiens, because a species name is a categorization that could only have been devised by us after we had already developed faculties that made us unique, faculties that made us human in a way not reducible to a biological species. And this points to the fact that neither of the two meanings of life that apply to us can be said to rest definitively and exclusively on the foundation of the other. Rather, they are mutually interdependent, because on the one hand, we had to have biological life before we had human life. Were we not biologically alive, we wouldn't be here having this conversation. But on the other hand, we had to have human life before we could know that we had biological life, because there's no non-human organism on this planet that's remotely capable of having the discussion we're having here today. A human embryo or human fetus undoubtedly has biological life. It's composed in part of the germlines of its biological parents, and the germline is the part of an organism's biology that can be transmitted to a subsequent generation. But an embryo or fetus is not a person we can know, even though in recent years it's become possible to obtain from an embryo something called a genome-wide polygenic score. In 1969, a human embryo was created in a laboratory for the first time in Britain. There were earlier claims to have achieved this, but 1969 saw the first robust evidence. And then, thanks to a decade's hard work by Robert Edwards, Patrick Steptoe, and Jean Purdy, this technology was used to establish a successful pregnancy, and the world's first IVF baby, Louise Brown, was born in 1978. And this landmark led to a formidable philosopher called Mary Warnock, who was patron of my charity, the Progress Educational Trust, up until her recent death, being asked by the British government to lead a committee developing a framework for regulating embryo research and fertility treatment. And here we come to an interesting fact. Whereas restrictions on abortion seek to ensure that life inside the womb, life in vivo, is preserved, at least after a certain cut-off point, restrictions on human embryo research seek to ensure that life outside the womb, life in vitro, is destroyed after a certain cut-off point, or if not destroyed, only allowed to continue in a particular form. I think there are useful biological landmarks we can use to frame, but not necessarily to decide, the question of when an entity possessed of biological life can be said to have acquired potential human life and actual human life. But these landmarks are not definitive and unchanging. They're naturally elusive. But more than that, they can increasingly be deliberately altered or sidestepped via human ingenuity. I can give some examples of this during our later discussion. But the key point I want to draw from it is that a biological fact cannot by itself do the moral work of deciding when human life might have begun. Furthermore, as long as pregnancy is involved in early life, then a pregnancy must be borne by someone. And the autonomy of this someone, the autonomy of the pregnant woman, is a frame that circumscribes all other framing of early life by biological landmarks. I'll finish by returning to the words of Mark Hollis, words which may yet prove to be immortal, even though Hollis himself, being human, sadly was not. Life's what you make it. Don't backdate it. Celebrate it. Anticipate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Kali Abdullah Obonyo is a Kenyan obstetrician and gynecologist. We're now going to have a look at fetal life from the front lines of life where people sometimes lose their lives as a result of not being able to have access to abortion care. Kali?
In my daily line of work, I regularly encounter 3 different scenarios concerning pregnancy. Some women are accompanied by their partners or spouses. Most are alone. So picture the first scenario. Doctor, I'm pregnant. Yay! It's a celebration. The second scenario, doctor, I'm pregnant. Help me. The third scenario, doctor, we've been trying for so long. We cannot get pregnant. All these 3 different women look up to me and trust that I'll walk with them in their journey with empathy and compassion. I want to flash back to my formative years as a teenager. In my first year of secondary school, just after the July-August vacation, it's a long vacation, one of the girls who was ahead of us did not come back to school. And there was whispers, this girl had actually died. And we were told later she had died as a result of post-abortion complications. So the nuns swung into action, put us into this big auditorium. We didn't know what to expect. They said, we're going to watch a movie. We're going to watch a movie. The movie that came was what is now termed the silent scream. It was a scan of a woman undergoing a procedure. We call it uterine evacuation. And the scanner was scanning the whole process as this doctor was putting in a probe, it's a cannula, to try and evacuate the contents. And he was explaining that the fetus is moving away from the probe. And the way the mouth was moving, it's as if this fetus is in pain, as if this fetus is having a silent scream. So all the girls in the room were horrified. In fact, most were crying. It wasn't a good experience at all. But I guess it was the nuns' way of helping us deal with the situation. In fact, in our school, there was no sexual education. And if you were not taught at home about what your body will be going through, what to anticipate, you were basically alone. I, for one, ran to the Irish nun, the Irish headmistress, and I told her, I think I've been bitten by an insect. You know, there's some blood on my underwear. Little did I know that I was having my first menses. The maternal mortality rate in the developing world, as you all may be aware, is very high. In Kenya particularly, it's between 400 to 450 per 100,000 live births. Those are many women dying as they contribute to the population. The fact is, 35% of these deaths is contributed by unsafe abortion. This happens to be the most easily preventable cause of death and disability. It comes as no surprise that when a woman or a girl is determined to terminate her pregnancy, she will do so, regardless of these laws, regardless of the safety, regardless of the situation that she finds herself in. In instances where safe abortion care is not available, she will risk her life with an unsafe abortion. often because the prospect of continuing this pregnancy is surely unbearable. Globally, the scale of post-abortion complications is enormous. About 7 million women and girls are admitted each year. 6 out of 10 of these will be permanently damaged. Some will never be able to be pregnant again. Unfortunately, 1 in 6 of these women will have lost their lives. Imagine the cost of unsafe abortions. A recent study by the African Research and Population Council, just in February last year, found out that the financial cost is staggering. Have we thought about the indirect costs? The costs to the family, to the husband, to the other children, to her parents. What is the indirect cost of unsafe abortion? Yet we will never know the full extent because there are many women and girls who cannot access this care. Unsafe abortion, sadly, is a disease of the poor. It's marked by use of dangerous methods. Sharp sticks, clothes hangers, ingestion of toxic substances. What is life? When does life begin? Can we end that life? I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. What does the issue of life in the uterus look like from the front line of abortion care? We're now going to hear from Patricia Lahore, Medical Director from the UK's largest abortion provider, the British Pregnancy Advisory Service.
As you've heard, my name is Patricia Lahore, and I'm an obstetrician and gynecologist. And after I finished my core training, I completed a fellowship in family planning and contraception research, so focusing my career on abortion and contraception. In my career, I've helped people with pregnancy, whether they wanted to prevent one, whether they wanted to continue one, if they were losing one, or they wanted to end one. The idea that people should have the right to determine the course of their lives is what initially engaged me in abortion care. As an undergraduate, I was involved in pro-choice politics. It was a right. But it was actually a death that made me decide to devote my career to ensuring that people can access the abortions that they want and need. In 1998, I was a medical student in California, and in October of that year, Dr. Barnett Slepian in upstate New York was murdered in the kitchen of his home after he'd come home from a memorial service for his father. Dr. Slepian was an abortion provider in his community, and he was killed for providing abortion care. The murder was one of 5 sniper attacks by anti-abortion extremists in 4 years in northern New York and in Canada. And Dr. Slepian was the 4th doctor, and up to that time, the 7th person in the United States to be murdered for performing abortions. Now that number stands at 11. At that point, I decided that if I had the knowledge and the skill to provide abortions and the moral fortitude to do so, then I should do so. Because it became very clear to me that without clinicians willing to provide, women would be compelled to continue pregnancies that they did not want, regardless of the legal framework. As I continued in my medical training, I learned to appreciate the public health need for abortion. 1 in 3 women has an abortion. Look around this room, 1 in 3 women. And this statistic is true around the world. And it doesn't matter if abortion is legal or illegal. 1 in 3 women will end a pregnancy through abortion in their lifetime. The difference, of course, is that where abortion is restricted, thousands of women die, and hundreds of thousands of women are injured every year from abortions attempted by untrained providers in unhygienic conditions or by themselves on their own, alone, and taking desperate measures. So pregnancy for women seeking abortion, in my view, is not just about a biological or developmental process, but the potential for a biographical existence. And it's intertwined with hers, and it's upon which she makes her choice, at the same time knowing that there is biology at play. There are things happening that signal life, and there's development happening every day that makes that pregnancy in her uterus more and more recognizable and like us, but not the same as us. Not living a life as we know it, as she knows it, as she experiences it, and as she envisions it. So this is where empathy comes into play so strongly for me and for many people who perform abortions. Because I cannot envision a circumstance in which I would actively withdraw my skills so that a woman is compelled to continue a pregnancy that for whatever reason she cannot continue. In doing so, and in acting with that degree of empathy, it is absolutely the case that a potential life is put in a subordinate position to a woman's life. But I think it remains morally responsible to do so. And in many ways, when life begins is subjective for the woman who's pregnant, and as an empathetic provider of care to her, I must act in response to her subjective interpretation. In a lot of ways, this cycles me back to what initially motivated me to become involved in this issue, which is protecting a woman's right to self-determination. But in this case now, as the person who can help her realize her goal, facilitating that right to self-determination in a less political way, in a more personal way, in a way that's less about me and more about her, and when she is ready to bring a life into this world as she knows it. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Now we're going to have a look at life from a religious and ethical perspective. We're going to hear from Sheila Briggs, Associate Professor of Religion at the University of Southern California. Sheila.
I asked today to be the last person to speak because what I wanted to model in the arrangement of these lectures was what I believe is the position of theology, and indeed what the theologians of the Catholic tradition believed, still most of them do believe, is that we listen to science. Now, it may come as a surprise to many of you that the Catholic Church does not claim to have knowledge about when life begins, which is independent of science. So the Catholic Church, in its teaching on abortion, is not claiming a theological source for its position of abortion being the taking of life. One of the most important reasons for prohibiting abortion, something that later Christian theologians make much of, is that abortion was sought to cover lust, immoral sexual behavior, that a woman who got pregnant outside of marriage would seek an abortion to hide her vice. Later, Christians would say her sin. That was the sin of abortion, not the taking of a human life. In many ways, it is Aristotle's science that became the science of the Catholic Church on which it based its teaching of abortion. Now, in Aristotle, there are two ways of approaching this question: when does life begin? The first, which is the question of when is the fetus formed? Now, in Aristotle's biology, he believed that human beings are basically made up of our bodies. But how does that our bodies know what shape to take on? How do our bodies become actual individual entities? And the answer to that was that during generation, procreation, the male sperm delivered the form, the woman delivered the matter. So the understanding was that the male sperm provided the blueprint for the matter in the woman's womb to be formed into a human individual. So the question of the unformed or formed fetus is the question of when does a fetus become an individual. But that is only one part of the question for Aristotle: when does life begin? The next question is, at what point does a fetus gain an intelligent soul? Now, one of the important things to know about ancient understandings of the soul, which were later taken up by Christian Catholic theologians, is that there are several levels of the soul. Aquinas, who is so important for the development of the Catholic tradition, and very much utilized Aristotle's teaching on the souls and the various levels and hierarchy of the soul. He understood from Aristotle that the fetus does not initially have an intelligent soul. So it's only at a certain stage that a human fetus moves from these lower levels of soul to the level of the intelligent soul, the rational soul. And famously, following Aristotle, Aquinas placed this at 40 days for a male, 90 days for a female. Now, is this what makes a human person? When you actually have very clearly a human person is at the point of birth, because at that point you have not only a human individual, not only a potential person, but somebody who is now independently of their mother interacting with the world. I do not think that you have an independent human person until birth. That birth has to be the cutoff point. It may seem in some cases arbitrary, but there are good reasons to make this arbitrary line. When we discuss this theologically, the basic premise that we should be thinking of in terms of the unborn child is what will most benefit the born child. So the real question of what is our obligation to the unborn is the question of what are in the interests of the born child. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. And now we're going to take some questions from you, the audience, and we're going to have some discussion with our panelists. Can we have some questions from the audience?
My question is for Stuart. When, for you, does life start to matter morally?
Stuart?
Yeah, well, it is a very difficult question. What you're looking for, if I understand your question, is something inherent to the fetus which kind of says, now I'm a moral entity. And I don't think there's anything in the fetus that does that. There's no strong qualitative difference between the beginning and the end that makes me think that now you have a morally different being. All the way through the pregnancy, its existence relies on the cooperation of the woman, and the woman remains the autonomous agent all the way through. That's my take on it.
How do other people... Yes, Sandy.
I think there are certain assumptions underpinning your question which are on the verge of being overturned. So you say, you know, we have this thing called the fetus, and should it be regarded as something as lowly as a bunch of cells? Actually, the question increasingly is, should a bunch of cells be thought of as a fetus?
But Sheila, can I ask, when does life matter morally? When is that time? When is that moment that we actually say, this life matters?
That is a social and cultural decision. There isn't a simple biological marker for it. Because, yes, the brain begins to take on the developments that allow our sort of human intelligence with the 24th week in pregnancy, but brain development goes on way beyond birth. So you're not going to be able to find the simple biological marker. So it has to be some social and cultural decision.
Thank you. Callie, you spoke a lot about helping women. Is it never the case, though, that we need to help the fetus? Why not extend the same compassion and care that you so eloquently express for women to the fetus?
I don't know the fetus. I know the mother. I know the person who comes to me. If she wants this pregnancy to continue, we are helping her. And by extension, helping the fetus to reach to term. If they get to 32 weeks, whatever, we're reaching the best possible chance for this fetus to come out and breathe and score well as a child. But there's no way a fetus would have come to me and asked for help, because the house of the fetus is the woman who I know. And the woman says, right now, my circumstances, my finances, my brain, I'm not ready. I'm not ready, and I need the house to be intact.
Any other questions?
So I have a question to all of you. Do you consider a fetus a body part, like an appendix, for instance, or does it have a moral standing?
We start with Sheila.
I do believe that the fetus has moral standing, moral entitlement, and I think that depends on the stage of the pregnancy. But moral entitlement is something very, very different from a moral right. Rights only exist in human society. You have to be born to enjoy rights. And the loss of that distinction in the term right to life is extremely problematic. The moral standing of a fetus does not necessarily entitle it to life. There are many biological forms of life which have moral entitlements. Animals have moral entitlements, but that does not mean that we should have an absolute rule of vegetarianism.
Patricia?
So in my experience, women don't view the fetus or fetal tissue as being the same as an appendix or any other body part. They view it as being something different. And many women, for example, think that that fetal tissue should be treated differently after the abortion. Some people, for example, want to memorialize that tissue after the abortion. They might want to bury it. They might want some sort of ceremony. Some women don't. So my experience is that women view it in many different ways, and I accept all of those interpretations.
So in your professional experience, does it happen often that someone has an abortion and then comes to regret it afterwards?
She may make a decision that she regrets later in life. We all make decisions sometimes that we wish we hadn't made. But I don't think that I would quite say it's a bad decision or a good decision. It was the decision that she made at that point in her life. And it's my job to respect that decision.
Yeah, I think there's an important distinction to be made between, regretting the termination of a pregnancy and regretting the circumstances that might have led to it or might have led it to be considered necessary. Furthermore, I believe what you've just said, that few women, in your experience, regret having had an abortion. But I have to say, even if it transpired that many more of them did, my view on the matter would probably not be all that changed. As long as it was a free choice, we all make choices we regret, and we should be free to.
What do you think? Do you think the law should regulate when people can have abortions or not?
So yes, my answer is no, because that's what has been argued when I have this debate with people from my community, that at least the father or the person that you conceive the child with has a say. So coming to the legislative part, I think that something that is, as long as it is part of your body, you are the only person that has a say on the matter.
Mm-hmm. So the location of the fetus, it being inside of the woman, suggests to you that it is the woman's right to decide.
It's not even debatable for me. It should be taken for granted. Like, it happens in your body. It's part of your body, and there's the only thing you have control over in how society is shaped today.
Another question from the audience? Do you have any other questions?
So my question is for Stuart. If the fetus can feel pain, does this negate our right to terminate it?
The question of pain gets raised often. I would answer it in many different ways. One way I would answer it is to say that whatever the experience the fetus might have, I don't think it's the equivalent to the experience you would have when you were in pain. So, for example, if somebody's attacking your leg with a scalpel, you will have a certain fear, anxiety, concern associated with that, which will be enhanced if this is not an invited attack, and will be diminished if it's part of surgery and you know exactly what is going on. We know that the fetus can't have that kind of level of understanding of what is happening, and so that suffering, that anxiety, that side of it is not a side that the fetus is sharing. What is it might be experiencing is some sort of pure immediacy, it just gets filled with pain. And that is completely incorrigible, undoubtable. It's kind of just a reflection of the biological being of the fetus. It's just another extension of it. And one of the things I'm trying to get across with my analysis of this is that our experience isn't like that. So our experience isn't just sense-driven. It isn't just that this room is white and so you experience white. No, that's not the way in which it works. That white is integrated into a greater psychological whole that is your personhood. That was why I was going on about the cube so much. You just see a cube, but you don't have to see a cube. You can see something else. You can see 4 separate faces or 3 separate faces, depending on exactly where you're standing in front of the cube. So I would reassure that the pain, whatever it might be, can't be comparable or equivalent to what you and I experience. The conceptual, conscious experience that we bring to the experience just isn't there yet for the fetus.
Thank you. We take another question from the audience.
My question is for Sheila. Do you think the presence of biological life is the equivalent of personhood?
No, not simply. Obviously, if we're talking about adults or born persons, biological life accompanies personhood. We are only persons as long as we are alive as born people. So in that sense, biological life accompanies personhood. And I think that stressing the biological is significant in some cases. For instance, when we're talking about prenatal life, I mean, it is a very important threshold of when the brain develops in such a way as it becomes the basis for personal life of a born person. That is something significant. But I think biological life and the development of biological life is very complex. And it's the meanings that we give that which relate to such things as personhood. Personhood is not a biological concept. It is how we make sense of our biology.
Thank you. Let's have another question from the audience.
Aren't we playing God?
Well, the church is playing God when it privileges the fetus's life over the mother's life. I mean, that argument cuts both ways. The reality is that we do not know what God thinks about abortion. In fact, in the New Testament, there is no mention of abortion. In fact, in the ancient world and in early Christianity, even with its historical roots in Judaism, which had seen abortion as problematic, abortion was a very minor issue. It was not this defining issue of moral theology, of Christian morality that the church teaches us today. I don't think that the official Catholic Church at this point in time makes any useful contribution because it has taken such an absolute position. It does not contextualize its teaching on abortion. And that in practical terms, this leads to so much misery in the world that it is certainly, in this case, right for secular society to ignore the Catholic Church. But what I think the Catholic tradition can contribute is precisely to raise questions about how we should think about, when life is there in a meaningful way, what it is entitled to. That is important.
Stuart, there's an anti-abortion slogan, abortion stops a beating heart. Mm-hmm. Is there an element that abortion is actually killing a fetus?
So obviously the abortion does cease a life in the sense that there's a beating heart. I mean, that's an undeniable truth. And the point I was trying to get across in my talk is that if you try and find the morality in the technicalities, I think you've got a problem. There's no reason why we would elevate the moral of having beating hearts around, in and of itself. We only elevate that because it supports the life of somebody that you want to continue having a life. The entire point of the abortion is to not have that outcome. So the morality really lies in whether or not you accept that the abortion is the right decision or not. Nothing to do with the beating heart in and of itself.
I think it's a mistake to place that much importance on the heartbeat. The heartbeat is two simultaneous things. It is this biological, physiological phenomenon, and it is also this thing, this cultural phenomenon, this thing endowed with meaning in the way that Sheila has described, that we endow things with meaning. The heart is a red emoji in a shape that is not at all physiologically accurate. Yes, of course, when people hear a heartbeat, even if they hear a fetal heartbeat and it's a wanted pregnancy, Stuart has described this very movingly, then of course that will mean an awful lot to them and that heartbeat will be very moving, but the heartbeat per se is not. It's up to us to make meaning of heartbeats on a more individual level. We shouldn't confuse the cultural heart with the biological heart.
Thank you. Today we've had the opportunity to ask some tough questions, to look at some very important issues about life in the womb and what it means to us from a scientific point of view, from a medical point of view, from a theological point of view, asking questions about morals and values and ethics. I hope ultimately that when we think about these questions, people like myself who believe in a woman's right to decide, we can understand that women are the very people who need to be trusted with these important decisions. Thank you very much.